What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Bush coming at you solo today to bring you who is the next league-winning tight end in 2022. So I actually have COVID right now. I'm kind of powering through to get this one out to you guys. But basically what we want to know in this video is who is the next Mark Andrews on the high end and who can be the next, Dalton Schultz, Dawson Knox type on the lower end. The tight end position, often overlooked in fantasy football. For example, I know this video won't get as many views, as the running backs or the wide receivers, but just like any other position, there's guys at the tight end position that can propel you to the playoffs, ultimately to championships as well. So in this video, we're going to break down the entire top 24 tight ends in underdog ADP to determine who has the ceiling, who doesn't, who's too risky, who's safe, etc. And with training camp opening, make sure you guys are following us over on TikTok. I had a new segment that I've been doing, every day for the past couple days. The one that I did yesterday actually popped off for like 110,000 views. So I really appreciate the support there. If you guys aren't following us over on TikTok, make sure that you are, because I'll be covering, everything from, Roto World blurbs and news and, usage type of stuff that you won't get over here on YouTube. So TikTok is where to find that, tiktok.com/fantasy stock exchange. Drop a like on this video if you enjoy. Comment any of your thoughts down below as well. Who do you think is the next league winning tight end? And subscribe to the channel if you enjoy. So that being said, let's hit the intro. Okay, so at the tight end position, my definition of a league winner is really one of two things. And this is the only position that I think has two definitions of a league winner, because a tight end that's drafted early that produces an elite win rate, similar to what we saw from Mark Andrews, would definitely be considered a league winner in my book. And that's kind of how I've been identifying league winners at the other positions. But I also think at tight end specifically, any tight end that turns into like a set it and forget it every week starter that you got really, really late in the draft also probably qualifies as a league winner, because this is a scarce position. And if you can find stable production, it usually really helps you try and get to a fantasy championship, because you don't need an elite scorer at this position. If your roster is really solid at running back, wide receiver, and quarterback, you can have a Dalton Schultz, Dawson Knox, Kyle Pitts or something from last year and still win a championship. I myself won the championship with Kyle Pitts because the rest of my roster was quite good. So while Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, Kyle Pitts, George Kittle, and Darren Waller, the top 5 elite tight ends this year, are likely to provide that positional advantage, their raw point production is not nearly as high as some of the running backs and wide receivers being drafted around them. So the reason that you draft those guys is so that you have a set it and forget it elite tight end, but you can also piece together that production if you're good at it. And for me personally, the reason I generally pass on the elite tight ends is because the goal of fantasy football is to score more points than your opponent. It's not to have the best, tight end position slot. It's to have the most points at the end of the week. So the reason I don't draft those elite tight ends is because why would I draft a guy with, 16 to 18 point per game upside in those elite tight ends when I can draft Javonte Williams, Saquon Barkley, AJ Brown, Mike Evans, who I think have 20 plus point per game upside. And the goal at the end of the day is to score the most points. So that's my attitude on early round tight ends. They need to fall to a certain point where wide receivers and running backs aren't as plentiful. And usually that point for me is like round 4 to round 6. And every year, a few of them fall to that area. So usually I'm targeting whatever guy, kind of goes the latest of those dudes. So this year, based on my mock draft kind of experience and the guys that I've drafted on Underdog a ton, the guys that fall typically are Kittle, Waller, and Schultz. So I've been getting plenty of those guys in Underdog drafts and not a ton of Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, and Kyle Pitts. So the way I handle this position is simple. If I don't get one of those elite guys to fall, I try and spot breakout candidates and solid production late in the draft. And in the rest of this video, I'm going to outline some of my biggest late round targets that I've been going after in underdog drafts and what I will be going after once I get to my home league. So let's get into the tight ends that we're using for this sample. If you guys haven't seen the other videos, wide receiver, running back, and quarterback, I'm going to try and speed through this one for the tight ends because I've already kind of broken it down in all the other videos, but we're going to take the averages of past league winners at the position from 2013 to 2021. And the threshold that we're using for the tight end position is 14 plus PPR points per game. Now, it was 20 plus PPR points per game on the other positions, playing 12 or more games overall. But why I have it listed as 14 for tight ends is because tight ends just don't score as many points as the other positions. And on average, a top 3 season in points per game at the tight end position was about 14 PPR points per game. So these guys were truly, set it and forget it dudes, positional advantages the years that they had these seasons. So you guys can see them. There's 28 of them on the screen since 2013. This past year, we had Mark Andrews, Travis Kelce, George Kittle as the qualifying tight ends there. In 2020, there was only 2 of them, Travis Kelce and Darren Waller. You guys can see going back to 2013, Jordan Cameron, Vernon Davis, Julius Thomas type of seasons. As always, anything that they ranked in green in means that they were above average, yellow about average, and red below average among this sample of elite tight ends. And these were the averages that it actually spit out: 8 targets per game, or 128 targets overall on the season, 5.5 receptions per game, about 90 receptions, 0.59 touchdowns, or about 9.5 on the season. So these were the averages and the paced averages to 16 games, but volume isn't everything, right? We know that from the other positions, and not all volume is equal. For example, George Kittle, Tyler Eifert, and Julius Thomas in this sample were able to have elite seasons despite not being huge volume type of dudes. So here are the situational factors that also matter for this position. And you guys can see I broke down a number of these for the other positions. For the tight end position, more than any other, you don't need to be perfect because you're only achieving 14 plus PPR points per game. You're not going for, a 20 plus point per game season. You can miss out on some of these areas and still be quite good. Really talented options at the position, just as NFL players, guys in great offenses, etc. Which usually all it took to have one of these elite seasons. So you may only need 1 or 2 things going your way to propel you to an every week starter at this position and eventually a league winner. So what I did was I tested how good these tight ends offense were, how good their quarterbacks were in quarterback rating, how much they passed the ball relative to the rest of the league. And the most important 4 factors are the ones that are on the left, the bottom 4. And the reason I think that they're the most important is because they're the easiest way that we can identify future breakout candidates. And for example, you guys can see on the screen right now, I have 28 tight ends, 14 plus PPR points per game as I was doing this study. Only Tyler Eifert in 2015 and Julius Thomas in 2013, who scored a bunch of touchdowns, were not first or second on their team in targets per game. So typically, to be one of these elite tight end options, you have to be heavily involved in your team's passing game, which is difficult at the tight end position. I think as a fantasy community, we like to overrate how much tight ends will be involved in the offense because there's probably only 3 or 4 to 5 guys every year that lead their team in targets or second in their team in targets at this position. So being able to identify which of those guys could potentially be that this year is one of the keys to being able to, crack the tight end code. And only Travis Kelce in 2019 was not first or second on his team in total touchdowns. So basically, we just need tight ends that are going to be heavily involved in their team's passing game and their team's red zone as well, because this is an extremely easy way to identify which tight ends might make good investments. I'm not huge on target competition being a huge deterrent for wide receivers, but I only think that for the great wide receivers. The reality of target competition is that there isn't a ton of difference makers at the tight end position. So when less talented position players have less target competition, they're more likely to be involved in their offense. And on top of that, they're not running as many routes as wide receivers. So it does matter a little bit more for them if they have less guys to compete with for targets. So I'll dig into this more on the player section, but some of the guys that fit this description outside the top 5 elite guys are listed here. You guys can see Dalton Schultz, TJ Hawkinson, Dawson Knox, Pat Freiermuth, Cole Kmet, Hunter Henry, and David Njoku. All these guys kind of have the chance to be either the number 1 or number 2 target in their offense, and the number 1 or the number 2 target touchdown score in their offense outside of the elite 5. I also wanted to test how often these tight ends played in line, because I think an underrated part of the tight end position is being out there running routes to see if there was an advantage for tight ends that were, used in the slot more, used out wide more versus guys that were used in line, because typically if you're used in line, you're more likely to stay in and block. And 20 of the 28 tight ends that were in the sample were under 50% of the time inline blocking. They were usually outrunning routes for the most part. And lastly, rank in yards per route run, the final metric I tested, obviously quite important because it determines a tight end's talent. And knowing that the tight end position isn't running as many routes as the wide receiver position, most often you need to be efficient on your targets, and yards per route run is a big time indicator of that. And you guys can see what the averages ended up being. You needed to be on average in about a top 10 offense with a top 8 quarterback, needed to be about the top 1 or 2 target on your team, top 1 or 2 target in terms of touchdowns on your team, in line about 40% of the time, and a top 5 tight end in yards per route run. So let's get into this group of tight ends, the guys that we're looking at this year. I'm looking only at the top 24 in ADP because very few other guys matter. And even once we get to like tight end 17, it starts to fall off a cliff. So typically those league winning ceilings that we're looking for will come from one of 3 paths. Number 1, we might get a premier target potential type of tight end like Darren Waller in years past, or Zach Ertz in recent years. Premier touchdown potential is the most common, I would say, for the tight end position, because we've seen guys like Jimmy Graham, Rob Gronkowski, Tyler Eifert, and Julius Thomas put up great seasons because they scored a lot of touchdowns. And even guys, like Eric Ebron a couple of years ago put up seasons like that. And then there's also guys that could have a combination of the two, which obviously presents the highest ceiling. If you're a high target guy and you have a chance to score a lot of touchdowns, that definitely makes you a 18 plus PPR point per game type of scorer like we saw from Mark Andrews last year, like we saw from Travis Kelce in 2020. So we're going to go 8x8 to determine who has this type of upside, 14 plus PPR points per game in their range of outcomes based on the averages that we determined in the first part of this exercise. And I'm going to speed through the first two because they're clearly locks. Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews have this type of ceiling. They've both shown it. We can move on to the next guys. But Kyle Pitts is more of a projection. He's the tight end 3 right now in ADP, but he's a great talent, obviously. We know he was a great talent coming out of school. We saw flashes of it his rookie season. He should get a ton of volume in his offense, and he's used basically as a flex wide receiver. So all that stuff is very important to his overall tight end finish that he could achieve. But the issue with Kyle Pitts is that he only scored 1 touchdown last year, and his quarterback play, I would argue, got even worse than what Matt Ryan did last year. So for me, there's too much risk with Kyle Pitts to be drafting him inside the top like 40 overall picks where he currently goes, especially when I can get Darren Waller, 20 picks later. I can get George Kittle 15, 20 picks later. And with Darren Waller, who's the next tight end here, I'm really starting to rise on him after this exercise because he checks so many boxes. I could argue that I was even a little too conservative with him because Derek Carr and the Raiders could be an ultra explosive offense. They could have been, a top 5 type of offense this year if things break right for him. And Darren Waller probably has the highest touchdown ceiling of his entire career now because Devontae Adams is going to draw a lot of attention in the red zone. And knowing that Darren Waller has potentially an increase in the red zone targets coming his way, he would be my pick to be the, this year's Mark Andrews, the elite win rate tight end that you still had to draft high because you currently have to draft him in like rounds 4 to 6, but depending on the room you're in, he might fall a little bit. I think more casual fans will hold his injury history against him from last year. And the addition of Devontae Adams, a lot of people will, do the too many mouths to feed thing. That'll slide him down in ADP. But make no mistake, he's still Derek Carr's go-to dude. I know Devontae Adams is going to be a stud this year, but I think Darren Waller has plenty of room to be great and could have an outlier type of touchdown season as well. George Kittle, I also really like, but unfortunately for George Kittle, he doesn't have ideal conditions around him. He's a first-year starting quarterback in Trey Lance, who's likely to make this a more run-heavy offense, even than it's already been one of the most run-heavy offenses in the league. And it's more target competition than he's been used to seeing, especially since his 2018 breakout season, where it was just him really to command targets on that team. Now we have Debo, who's a certified stud. We have Brandon Ayuk, and that's more than really he's ever had at the position. And I still like George Kittle because he falls, typically to round 4, round 5, and he's also elite. I think he's the best tight end in the NFL. But from an efficiency standpoint, he's really going to have to carry his outlook. Dalton Schultz is where rubber meets the road. He is the first tight end that I would consider not elite. Dalton Schultz performed unbelievable in this exercise, though, as well, because the only real question you can say about Dalton Schultz is that is he a elite difference-making talent? And probably not, but I don't really even personally think that matters because this is such a pass-heavy offense with a great quarterback who I think, might have his best season yet. Clear number 2 receiver on this offense behind CeeDee Lamb, especially with Michael Gallup about to be out for the first few games of the season. He could even lead his team in touchdowns. So he'd be my pick this year for, the tight end that comes from the mid rounds that ascends to a top 3 overall finish. Maybe not quite a Mark Andrews level ceiling, like I said, for Darren Waller, but I think he could have, this 14 plus points per game type of ceiling that, we would have seen on the thumbnail. Dalton Schultz is the guy that is blurred out on there. So TJ Hawkinson, tight end 7 right now in ADP. He's solid from a volume perspective, but the offense likely won't be that great. And the touchdowns won't be super high ceiling as well, because working in Hawk's favor is obviously that he's going to be probably the number 2 in that offense behind Amon-Ra St. Brown. We don't expect Jameson Williams to be on the field right away. And that makes me think of him a little bit more favorably, but it's Jared Goff. It's the Detroit Lions. They're going to run the ball quite a bit as well. So, interesting outlook for TJ Hawkinson. I think he's a little overrated in ADP right now, but I don't think he's a bad pick necessarily. So let's move on to the final tight end of this tier, which is Dallas Goedert. Dallas Goedert, I would just rather straight up have than TJ Hawkinson, a guy who's been ultra efficient and great at commanding targets when he's been on the field. I think there's a range of outcomes where he leads this team in touchdowns for an improving second-year starting quarterback in Jalen Hurts, maybe even a top 10 offense in the Philadelphia Eagles. So I really like Dallas Goedert as well. The tight end 9 in ADP is Dawson Knox. He has very few unknowns about him because we know that he's in a great offense with a great quarterback in an elite pass-heavy offense as well, and a quarterback who just happens to be his best friend off the field. I really don't think people are baking in the fact that Dawson Knox was essentially a first-year full-time starter this year, because in the previous 2 seasons of his career, he was running like 50% of the routes. This year, he jumps up to 75%, scores 9 touchdowns, and is, quite good from a fantasy perspective from what most people expected. He's also a freak athlete, and I'm kind of surprised that more people aren't in on Dawson Knox because tight ends typically take 3 to 4 years before they develop in the NFL, and they don't usually produce much in college either. And that was the case with Dawson Knox. He was just a great athlete that went to a great situation. So give me the potential for the leading touchdown scorer for Josh Allen in the 8th, 9th round, where you have to draft Dawson Knox. I would much rather take the shot on him than I would on, a Kyle Pitts ascending into the next level, because the price difference is just huge at that point in time. Dawson Knox, maybe not, an elite talent at the position, but he's in such an elite situation that all he really has to do is catch a bunch of touchdowns and see an uptick in targets to be great this year. And if you couldn't already tell, the reason I'm mostly out on some of these top dudes is because I really do like the outlook of most of the tight ends 4 to 12 type of range, more so than really any other year that I can imagine. And Zach Ertz is another guy that I think has a great outlook this year. Tight end 10, solid option as well. Should get off to a great start as the number 2, most likely, until DeAndre Hopkins is back on the field in week 6. Cardinals start notoriously fast as well. The last 2 years, they've been like the best offense in the league for the first 10 games. So if they're, firing away, Zach Ertz could be like a top 5 tight end to start the season. And maybe you can flip him into a Kyle Pitts or into a Darren Waller, into a George Kittle mid-season while those guys struggle to get their legs under them if Zach Ertz is off to a great start. I think he could be a 120 target tight end for a quarterback as good as Kyler Murray. So he's another guy that I really love late round. Irv Smith is just a huge question mark because he's a talented player and he's in a good offense, but that's pretty much all we know about him. We don't know how he's going to be used. We don't know what kind of target potential he has. And we assume that Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen, maybe even KJ Osborne, are going to out-target him. So he's probably not worth the risk at his price right now. I would much rather take Pat Freiermuth, who goes right behind him. He's one of my favorite late round guys this year. I've talked about him already, but unfortunately his quarterback play won't be great. But that's really the only thing that I don't think is going his way, because what he did as a rookie gives me a lot of confidence that he can be the number 2 wide receiver or the number 2 target in this offense behind Deontay Johnson and probably a safety blanket for those guys. So I really, really love Pat Freiermuth this year at his price. Cole Kmet, I definitely like him, but I just don't think he has a huge ceiling because Justin Fields, I just don't think is on shaky grounds because Justin Fields is on shaky grounds to take some massive step this year. If he had like a well set up situation around him, better offensive line play and all that kind of stuff, I could talk myself into Cole Kmet being much better this year. But I think if he gets there, it'll be just on volume. He'll be like 120 target tight end, similar to like Zach Ertz of old, but probably not a lot of touchdowns. Mike Gesicki, I'm likely out on. He's shown an ability to command targets in the past, but as I've kind of said for all of the Miami pieces, wide receivers and running backs, we just don't know how good Tua is going to be. We don't know how good the quarterback play is going to be or how good the offense is going to be. And we know that Mike Gesicki has 2 studs in front of him on the depth chart in Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, both, most importantly, 2 studs that play in the slot too. So they might kick Mike Gesicki out to more of like an inline role with Mike McDaniel coming in. He might deploy him more the way George Kittle is deployed, which is not, it sounds like a good thing, but it's not, because George Kittle is into block a lot more than Mike Gesicki has been in recent years. So that would actually be a negative for him, because if they start using those wide receivers more in the slot, then that takes Gesicki out of the slot. So the next guy here, Hunter Henry, another one of my favorites, late round tight ends, proven touchdown upside. We've seen him score a lot of touchdowns in recent years, including last year when he scored a couple touchdowns too. He was the clear tight end 1 for Mac Jones. He was running the most routes, playing the most snaps, and the upside comes where Mac Jones takes a step forward, because I think a lot of people are baking in the upside of like Elijah Moore and Darnell Mooney and Christian Kirk and the guys with the other second-year quarterbacks taking a step forward, but they're not really doing it with the Patriots, even though Mac Jones could take a huge step as a passer. He was clearly the best rookie quarterback last year. Who's to say he doesn't enter the realm of like a Kirk Cousins, Derek Carr level of quarterback as soon as his second season? And Henry is one of those few late round guys that could potentially lead his team in targets and at least in touchdowns at the very least. So I really, really like Hunter Henry as a guy to be maybe more like this year's Dalton Schultz, this year's Dawson Knox type of guy, but I really, really like him at his current cost. And then the final guy in this tier is Albert O. He's kind of just like Irv Smith, super unknown. We think he's talented, but he has a couple guys ahead of him on the depth chart. He has, Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton and probably even Tim Patrick as well. So I'm probably not going to get too much exposure to Albert O. The final tier of guys, I'm just going to speed through these real quick because there's not a ton of interesting names. Tight end 17 through tight end 24. David Njoku and maybe Robert Tonyan, depending on how his injury kind of plays out in training camp. They're guys that are kind of interesting to me. David Njoku, Albert O, and Irv Smith are basically all cut from the same cloth. They're unknowns, but we think they're talented and they could have some targets in potentially improved offenses, depending on whenever Deshaun Watson comes back. So I don't mind the dart throw at David Njoku late in drafts. Austin Hooper as the tight end 24, the very last guy on this list. I think he's a candidate to potentially emerge as well, just because I still think Tannehill's like a fine quarterback. I think everybody thinks he's a bad quarterback, but he's still, I think, a top 15 quarterback in the league. And Austin Hooper could be his number 2 wide receiver in that offense. And he's been a league winning tight end in the past in 2019. So maybe he can bounce back as part of a new offense, but it is, a run heavy offense. So I'm not expecting too much out of Austin Hooper, but probably a fine dart throw. And then Gerald Everett, Tyler Higbee, and Hayden Hurst, they all play in great offenses, but a lot of competition for targets with those guys. And I'm just not certain they're that good of tight ends anyway. So probably not going to be in on those dudes. So this is how the tight ends all scored out. As you guys can see on the screen, this kind of illustrates my point. The league winning tight ends are all being drafted very highly. We know that, Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews and Kyle Pitts and Darren Waller and all these guys have league winning upside, and they're being drafted accordingly. Dalton Schultz gets a lot of shit for going way ahead of Hawkinson and Goddard. I've seen a lot of people bring up the fact that they should all be going around the same range, but I think he absolutely deserves to go ahead of those guys in round 6 to 7, because once the wide receiver and quarterback position starts to dry up in that round 6 range, I really love the upside that Dalton Schultz presents. Like I said, I think he can be this year's, Mark Andrews, the tight end 5, tight end 6 in ADP that ascends to the tight end 1, because he has a chance to become the number 1 touchdown scorer, the number 2 target for one of the best offenses in the league, an offense that could, take the league by storm this year. So the answer to the question in the title of this video is, who's the next league winning tight end? For me, it's probably Darren Waller as far as like the high end range of outcomes. And he's one of my biggest targets as well. But Dalton Schultz is probably the guy that I think could be like this year's Mark Andrews, this year's, top 3 tight end that, didn't come out of nowhere, but we didn't expect him to have as high of a ceiling as he does. And then, of course, Dallas Goedert, Dawson Knox, Zach Ertz, Pat Freiermuth, and Hunter Henry are my main targets as well. So if you guys enjoyed this video at any point, again, I'm powering through some COVID-19 right now, so give me a like down below. This also took a lot of work, so really appreciate it. Comment any of your thoughts down below as well. Who do you think is the next league-winning tight end? Subscribe to the channel if you are new as well. Take some of this advice into Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code FSE at sign up and first deposit for 100% back on what you put in. So if you put in 20, you'll have 40 on the site to play with. Sharpen your strategy for your home league drafts at the same time as getting your shot of huge prizes in Best Ball Mania 3, $2 million to first place. The Puppy 3 is going to be dropping August 1st, and a ton more of other contests coming to Underdog Fantasy. Make sure you check that out if you're interested in getting both of our rankings for free as well. That's a free gift as a thank you for using our promo code. Also check out the Patreon. Again, rankings, all the data will be posted, a lot of other stuff as well, like rankings, other databases, Danny's contextualized game logs, etc. So with that being said, peace out. We'll talk to you soon.